Through a power of appointment, a settlor can give someone other than the trustee a non-fiduciary power to distribute the property. Chapter 12 opens up giving a typical example, and it's on page 807 if you'd like to follow along. H devises property to X in trust to distribute the income quarterly to W for life, and on W's death to distribute the principal to one or more of H's descendants, as W shall appoint in her will. H is the donor of a power of appointment. W is the donee, and H's descendants are the objects. By this power, which W holds in a non-fiduciary capacity, W may decide who among H's descendants will take the trust property at her death. The advantages of such an arrangement are really three. The first is flexibility. Because W can account for changing circumstances in the period after H's death, but before W's death. But because W cannot appoint the property for her own benefit, there's some tax avoidance that occurs, because no estate or gift tax will be due upon W's exercise of the power. The third benefit is that it can protect assets, because no creditor of W will have recourse against the appointed property. We'll begin by examining purposes, terminology, and types of powers of appointments. We're going to take a look at the jargon of the powers of appointment, including the names that are assigned to the parties and the various types of powers. Terminology and types of powers of appointment. Let's first define the terms used to describe persons. A donor is the person who creates the power of appointment. Oftentimes, this is the settlor. The donee holds the power. So in our previous example, the donee would be W. The objects are the person in whose favor the power may be exercised. An appointee is a person in whose favor the power is actually exercised. And takers in default of appointment are persons who take if the power is not exercised. Because remember, a donee has the option to exercise the power. Unlike a trustee that must exercise their powers, a donee has the option to exercise their power. General and non-general powers of appointment. A general power of appointment is one that is exercisable in favor of the donee, his estate, his creditors, or the creditors of his estate. In other words, in our previous example, since W could exercise the power in her favor, then it would be considered a general power. A non-general power is a power that is not a general power. You may also see it referred to as a specific power. It is a power that's not exercisable in favor of the donee. More on general versus non-general powers of appointment. The donor of a power of appointment can give the donee complete freedom to choose the appointees, or, on the other hand, the donor can choose to limit the appointment to a more narrowly defined class of objects. So, when the donor imposes no limits on a power's objects, which basically allows the donee to appoint even herself or her estate, then that power is considered a general power. Often, however, the donor wants to limit the donee's freedom to choose. And if the donor prohibits the donee from appointing herself or her estate, then the power is considered a non-general power. Now, of course, the donor can create even more limits on the donee's power aside from restricting her from appointing herself. And if it does have more powers, you can think of the power as being either exclusive or non-exclusive. So, if a donee is permitted to exclude some or many members of a class, then the donee's power is seen as being exclusive. If, on the other hand, the donor explicitly requires the donee to appoint some assets to every member of a class, then we say that power is non-exclusive. Whether or not a power of appointment is a general versus a non-general power has consequences for whether or not the donee's creditors can reach the appointed property. If it is a general power of appointment, then the donee has ownership equivalence. In other words, the donee could appoint the property to herself. As such, the modern law generally allows the donee's creditors to reach the appointed property. For non-general powers, the donee has no ownership equivalence because, by definition, the power does not allow the donee to appoint the property to herself. And therefore, the creditors of the donee cannot reach the appointed property. Sometimes the donor of a power gives the donee the power to appoint the property immediately, and at other times the donor postpones the donee's exercise of power. When the donee has a power that they are free to exercise immediately, then the donee is said to have a presently exercisable power. When the donee's power is not presently exercisable, then the donee holds what's called a postponed power. If the postponed power can only be exercised by a will, then that is called a testamentary power of appointment. So as we previously said, to exercise a power of appointment, the donee has to manifest an intent to exercise the power. 2, the manner of expression must satisfy any formal requirements that the donor might require. 3, the appointment must be a permissible exercise of power. And so we've talked a little bit about the manifestation of power and formal requirements imposed by donors. Let's talk a little bit now about permissible exercise of power. Even if a donee manifests an intent to exercise the power in the manner of expression satisfies the formal requirements to be a valid appointment, they still need, the appointment must be a permissible exercise of power. What are some permissible exercises of power? Well, a donee can appoint an object. So the donee can only appoint the property to someone who is the object of power. In most jurisdictions, the donee of both general and non-general powers can create a new power of appointment. The jurisdictions are going to look at whether or not it is exclusive or a non-exclusive power. A non-general power can be exclusive, and it's called exclusive if the donee can appoint all the property to one or more objects and excludes others. So if it is an exclusive power, then the donee has more freedom in appointing the property to whomever she feels matches with the intent of the settler. If it's a non-exclusive power, then there are more restrictions on who the donee can appoint the property to. And oftentimes, with a non-exclusive power, the donor will have specified in the instrument a particular amount that has to go to each object. If if an action was not a permissible exercise of power, then the salvage doctrines are there to help us address the non-permissible exercise. The first is allocation. An allocation is when the donee blends the appointed property with the donee's own property, and it is called blended property. So in order to address this, blended property can be allocated to various interests in the matter that best carries out the donor's intent. The next salvage doctrine is capture. And capture applies only to ineffectively or incompletely exercised general power. Because the donee of a general power could appoint to her estate under the capture doctrine, the appointed property passes to the donee's estate if the donee would prefer this in an event of an ineffective exercise of power. So if the donee of a general power does not exercise it, the property passes to the takers in default of appointment. Your text distinguishes between a disclaimer and a release. A disclaimer is a proper exercise of power, and it's when a donee disclaims her power. The donee is treated as never having acquired the power in the first place. So for a disclaimer, since it's a rejection of power from the outset, the disclaimant is treated as never having had that power. A release, on the other hand, is giving up a power of appointment after having it for some period of time. A donor who acquired a power may release it in whole or in part, and in a manner that reduces or limits the objects unless the donor did not intend the power to be releasable. As we discussed previously, a donee has a choice as to whether or not to accept a power or to exercise the power. A donee does not have to exercise their power of appointment. What happens if a donee decides not to exercise the power of appointment or fails to exercise the power of appointment properly depends on whether or not it is a general power or a non-general power. Under traditional law, if a general power is not effectively exercised, then the property passes to the takers in default of appointment. Or if there are no takers in default, then it goes to the donor or the donor's estate. The UPAA in the restatement changed this rule, and it directs the appointed property to the donee's estate unless the donee affirmatively refrained from exercising that power. And the theory is that the donor would prefer the property to pass to the donee's takers than to revert to the donor's successors. Well, what happens if the failure to exercise is the failure to exercise a non-general power? If the donee of a non-general power fails to exercise it, and there is no gift in default of appointment, then the appointed property may, if the objects are defined and limited in the limited class, then they can pass the objects of the power by way of an implied gift in default of appointment. Otherwise, the property refers to the donor or the donor's estate. And these rules are codified in the next couple of rules that are reprinted on this line.